I'm Nathaniel. Welcome back to the SleepStory Collective. At the SleepStory Collective, we keep things beautifully simple. We only have one mission: to help you unwind, let the day fall quiet, and ease gently into sleep. So tonight, as you settle in, there is nothing you need to force, nothing you need to finish first, nothing you need to hold together for a little while longer. The day has already had its turn. The noise has already had its turn. The bright, busy, insistent parts of life have already had that turn. And now, very gently, this time belongs to something slower. Let yourself notice the surface beneath you. Let yourself notice the weight of the blanket, the coolness or warmth of the room, the softness of the pillow, the place where your hands have come to rest, the place where your shoulders can begin to lower, the place where your jaw no longer has to hold the memory of the day. Take one easy breath in and let it go. Then another, not deeper than feels natural, not longer than feels comfortable, just enough to remind the body that it is allowed to soften now, allowed to unfasten, allowed to stop reaching so hard into the next thing. If thoughts are still moving, that is all right. They do not need to be switched off. They do not need to be pushed away. They can keep passing through, but they do not need the best seat in the room tonight. Something quieter can take that place. Something slower, something steadier. Something like a low lantern being lit in a darkened house. Something like the hush of wind moving over distant sand. Tonight, we are going somewhere wide and pale and moonlit. Somewhere the world is shaped in long curves and soft ridges. Somewhere the night has a rhythm of its own. Somewhere even silence seems to have texture. A place where the wind never quite stops speaking, but never raises its voice. A place where lamps glow low in whitewashed homes. A place where footsteps are quickly forgiven. A place where an artist works with patience, moonlight, and drifting grain. So let the breath ease. Let the forehead smooth. Let the eyes grow heavy if they wish to. Let your listening become simple. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to follow every sentence all the way to the end. You can let the words wash past you. You can let the story hold the shape of the night for you. So before we begin, give yourself permission to listen loosely. You do not need to hold on to every word. You do not need to follow each detail all the way to its end. You may drift. You may miss things. You may float in and out. You may let the story become atmosphere around you. The night will keep your place. I'll stay with you, and the path will remain lit, even if your eyes have already begun to close. And now, as the room around you begins to feel a little softer at the edges, and the day settles a little further away, tonight's story begins. Tonight's story is called The Sand Artist of Silent Dunes. At the far edge of the desert, where the last white houses of the settlement gave way to long, quiet ridges of sand, there lived an artist named Idris. He was known for making beautiful things that were never meant to last. By morning, much of his work would be softened. By the following night, most of it would be gone altogether. The wind would take one line, the moonlight would change another. A passing fox might leave a small, careful print at the edge of a curve. A child at dawn might disturb a pattern with delighted feet. And none of that troubled Idris in the slightest. In fact, he liked it that way. He lived alone in a small, cool house built from pale clay and lime, with a blue-green door, a flat roof, and a narrow inner courtyard shaded by woven reed panels. There were 3 rooms in the house, though to call them rooms made them sound grander than they were. There was the front room, where he received the occasional neighbor, or repaired tools, or sat by the low window in the final hour before nightfall. There was the sleeping room, plain and tidy, with a folded blanket, a low lamp, and the clay bowl for water. And there was the workroom at the back, which was not really a workshop in the noisy sense, but more like a place where the evening gathered itself before he walked into the dunes. That room held shelves of brushes, combs, wooden rakes, polishing cloths, reed measuring lines, small jars of mineral sand, and a long, shallow tray where he often practiced shapes with his fingertips before taking them to the desert. Every evening began in the same way. That was one of the reasons his work calmed him. The dunes changed, the wind changed, the moon changed. The surface of the sand never offered him exactly the same canvas twice, but the beginning of the night belonged to ritual. And ritual, done gently and often enough, has a way of teaching the body that there is nothing to fear. When the sun had lowered and the day had become more gold than white, Idris would open the reed screen across the back arch of the workroom and let the cooler air enter. The room would change almost at once. The heat trapped in the clay walls would begin to loosen. The hanging strips of woven palm fiber would move just slightly. The shelf of glass jars would catch the light in deeper colors. The pale sand in the practice tray would settle into a flat, dull glow. And the whole room would seem to exhale. Then he would sweep the floor. Not because it was dirty. There was always a little sand in his house, no matter how carefully he stepped, and he would have laughed at anyone who tried to keep a desert home free of it. He swept because the sound of the broom on the clay floor signaled the first soft turn of the evening. It was a low, dry sound, a whispering sound, a sound that said the day was folding up. The same sound every night, the same pace, the same loose figure-8 motion in the wrist. He would sweep the workroom first, then the front room, then the little threshold by the blue-green door. After that, he would roll the woven mat by the entrance, shake it once outside, and lean it back into place. Then he would wash his hands. Then he would light the first lamp. The first lamp always stood in the front room on a niche cut into the wall. It was made of brass, worn smooth from years of polishing, with small pierced patterns around its sides so that when lit, it threw tiny stars onto the white plaster behind it. Idris would trim the wick with a narrow knife. Then he would pour in a little oil from a stoppered bottle. Then he would touch flame to the wick and wait. There was always a moment, small and familiar, when the flame seemed undecided, a wavering glow, a breath of gold. Then steadiness. Then the wall behind it would bloom with warm dots of light. He would light only one other lamp in the house. That one belonged to the workroom. It was smaller, simpler, less decorative, more useful. Its glass chimney had gone slightly cloudy from years of cleaning, and its light was softer for it. He preferred that lamp when arranging his tools. Bright light was for markets and midday and needlework. This sort of work belonged to dimmer edges, to patient seeing, to the quiet confidence of things that did not need to show off. Once the lamps were lit, Idris would prepare his tea, always mint first, sometimes with a shaving of dried lemon peel, sometimes with a single green cardamom pod crushed lightly between his fingers. On cooler nights, he added a pinch of fennel. On windier nights, he preferred tea plain, with only the mint. He never hurried the kettle. He never rattled the cups. He never filled the room with unnecessary movement. The water heated, the leaves opened, the steam rose. That was enough. The cup he used for himself was a small clay one, glazed inside in pale blue. On the outside it was unadorned, except for one thumb-sized indentation made by the potter years ago, perhaps by accident, perhaps on purpose, which had become the natural resting place for his hand. He held it by that little hollow every night. He had two finer cups for guests, patterned in cobalt and ochre, but those stayed on the upper shelf most evenings, untouched and content. He would stand with his tea in the doorway of the back room and look out across the narrow courtyard, where a clay basin sat beside a potted night-blooming plant with thick leaves and pale flowers that opened only after dusk. On some evenings there were 3 blossoms. On some evenings, none. On lucky nights, the scent was already beginning to rise, soft and cool and faintly sweet, as if the air had remembered honey, but decided not to mention it loudly. From there, he could see just enough of the sky above the roofline to judge the color of the approaching night. If it was a clear evening, the first star would appear above the far wall while his tea was still warm. If high dust had come in from the deeper dunes, the sky would remain pearly a little longer. Idris liked both. Each had its own mood. Each suggested different lines for the sand. When the tea was finished, he began the choosing. He never took every tool. That would have been pointless. The dunes did not ask for abundance. They asked for attention. So he chose what the night required. A broad palm fiber brush for smoothing. A narrow brush with a longer handle for flowing lines. A small crescent comb for scalloped details. A double-toothed rake carved from tamarisk wood. A bundle of reed stakes. A loop of thin cord, a folded cloth for polishing the handles, sometimes a shallow brass dish, sometimes a lantern, sometimes a small hourglass with pale sand inside, though he used it less to measure time than to remind himself not to hurry it. He laid each tool on the table, wiped it clean if needed, tested the grain of the wood under his thumb, ran fingers across the bristles, checked the cord for knots, straightened the cloth. Then he rolled them into a long wrap made from thick, undyed cotton and tied it with 2 narrow bands. He had done that movement so many times, he no longer needed to look at his hands. They knew the fold. They knew the turn. They knew the weight of each piece. Outside, the settlement would already be lowering its voice. Clay doors closing softly, small rooftop conversations fading, a final bucket being poured onto a line of herbs. A boy called in from the lane, sandals tapped free of dust at the step. The call of the day, if it had ever been sharp, was gone by then. In its place came an evening hush that seemed to sit between the houses like a folded shawl. Idris did not leave at exactly the same moment every evening. He was not mechanical, but he always left after the first lamp had burned for a while and before the moon rose too high. There was a valuable hour in the night when the sand still remembered the day's warmth beneath its surface, but the top layer had cooled enough to take a clean mark. That was often the best hour for broad work. Later came detail. Later came listening. Later still came the slow final phase, when he did very little at all and let the wind make its own edits. Tonight was such a night of high clarity. The sky almost cloudless, the air light, the wind present but courteous. As he stood in the workroom fastening the final knot on the tool wrap, Idris felt something in the evening that he had learned to trust. It was not excitement exactly, not inspiration in the grand, dramatic sense, more like a calm readiness, a feeling that the dunes were already waiting in a particular shape, that the night had chosen a mood and was prepared to share it. He lifted the tool wrap, took the lantern, blew out the smaller lamp in the workroom, left the front room lamp burning low in its wall niche, and stepped out into the lane. The air outside had the cool edge that comes only after the heat has properly broken. The whitewashed houses around him held the last of the sunset on their upper walls, faint apricot fading into blue. A line of little clay bells hung under one awning and clicked softly as the breeze moved them. From an open window came the faint scent of cumin and warm bread. From another came laughter, not loud, but rounded and at ease. Idris passed these signs of home with a quiet fondness. He was a solitary man, but not a lonely one. He belonged to the settlement. And the settlement, though it left him undisturbed most evenings, had long ago accepted the gentle strangeness of his work. At the corner where the lane turned, there stood a wall shelf with a shallow bowl of white pebbles. It had been there for years. No one quite agreed how it began. Some said travelers once used it to leave a sign that they had passed safely through. Some said a child had started it with 3 smooth stones found after rain. Now it was simply part of the place. People touched the rim as they passed. Sometimes they took 1 pebble for luck. Sometimes they returned another. Idris always rested his fingers lightly on the bowl before leaving the last houses behind. Tonight he did so, then carried on. The lane thinned. The houses grew farther apart. The packed earth underfoot gave way to sand-smoothed ground. A stand of dry reeds marked the edge of the settlement well. Beyond them, the dunes began, first in low rises, then in longer silvering curves. The moon had not yet fully lifted clear of the horizon, but its light was already strong enough to catch the ridges. From a distance, the dunes looked almost still. Up close, they never were. Their surfaces trembled with the smallest movements, a skin of grains always listening to the air. The first rise was known among the settlement children as Lantern Back, because from its crest, the village behind looked like a scattered line of low golden dots after dark. Idris climbed it slowly, not because it was steep, but because he liked the change that happened as he reached the top. One step, the white houses were near. Another, they were lower. Another, the lanes narrowed. Another, the sounds from the settlement grew so soft they were almost imagined. At the top, he paused, as he always did, and looked back. The front room lamp in his own house could not be distinguished from the others, and he liked that too. A person's home did not need to stand out to be loved. Ahead lay the first of the night's working grounds. A shallow, open sweep he called the Welcome Basin. It was not where he made his most delicate pieces, nor his most ambitious ones. It was where he made the first marks of the evening. The basin had a broad, even floor and just enough shelter from the western side to keep the surface clean for a while. He often used it to settle his hand, to learn the mood of the wind, and to let the body make the transition from house rhythm to dune rhythm. He descended into the basin and set down the lantern. The moon was now higher. The upper ridges of the sand showed in pale bone white, while the hollows between them held cooler shades, almost blue. Idris knelt, untied the tool wrap, unrolled it onto the sand. Then he took the broad smoothing brush and began. The first sweeping passes were always slow, not merely because care was needed, though it was, more because the smoothing told his hands that the night had truly begun. Back and forth he moved the brush across the top layer. The sound was soft, dry, even. A gentle shh, then silence. Then shh again. The ripples left by the late afternoon breeze eased into a flatter surface. The shallower prints of a lizard near the edge were left untouched. He never erased everything. The dunes were not a blank page. They were already alive. He only prepared a section where his lines could speak more clearly. When the surface was ready, he set the brush aside and stood still for a moment, feeling the breeze on the side of his face. The wind tonight came in slow intervals, not constant, with small pauses between each moving breath. That suggested long curves rather than tight, repetitive detail. Good. He picked up the narrow, long-handled brush, placed its tip lightly on the sand, and drew the first line of the evening. It began as a low sweep near the basin floor, then rose gently, then doubled back on itself without fully meeting, like the path of a ribbon carried briefly in the air and then released. The line pleased him at once, not because it was perfect. He did not care for perfection. It pleased him because it matched the mood of the night. It belonged. That was all he ever wanted from the first line. Belonging. He drew a second above it, longer, looser. A third lower down, with a little more weight at the turning point. Then, between two arcs, he used the crescent comb to create a fan of fine scalloped marks that caught the moonlight in a different way. Already the basin was changing. Already the surface that had been quietly empty a few moments before had begun to hum with intention. He worked there for some time, though he never counted minutes in the welcome basin. He preferred to stop when his breathing had fully settled into the pace of the work. When the house had gone from his mind. When the last noise of ordinary life had thinned into distance. When his hand no longer felt like a person holding a tool, but like part of a longer motion passing through him. That was when he knew he could move to the deeper grounds. Before leaving, he made one final shape at the edge of the basin. A simple spiral no larger than a dinner plate. He made one somewhere every night, not for others, not as a signature, just as a small, private beginning. A reminder that every broad design, every great curve, every large, elegant composition still began with one line turning patiently in toward itself. He packed the tools again, lifted the lantern, and crossed the basin toward the second rise. The second rise led to a place called the Humming Posts. 3 short carved stones stood there, half buried, their tops scooped into smooth cups by weather and old hands. When the wind came from a certain angle, it passed over them with a low, rounded tone, not musical exactly, but close enough to calm the mind. Some said they had once marked a path. Some said they had been set there by a wandering stonemason with a sense of humor. Idris did not care who placed them. He was simply grateful they remained. Tonight, as he crested the rise, one of them gave a soft note, a low hum, then stillness, then another. He smiled. It meant the air higher up was moving a little more freely than below. That was useful to know. He set the lantern on the ground beside the middle post and listened. The 3 tones did not align into a tune. They arrived separately, one deeper, one thinner, one almost more vibration than sound. Taken together, they felt like the desert clearing its throat very politely. Idris always paused there. Sometimes he placed his palm over one hollow and felt the air pull beneath it. Sometimes he simply waited for 3 notes before continuing. Tonight, he waited for 3. After the 3rd hum, he lifted the lantern and went on, descending into a long, narrow valley between 2 dunes. The sand here was firmer underfoot. Old wind had packed it into satin plains that reflected the moonlight beautifully. At one end of the valley stood a small open shelter made from 4 date palm poles and a roof of woven reed. It was barely taller than a person, and only deep enough to cast a modest patch of shade by day or offer a little protection from wind by night. Idris called it the tea pavilion, though to call it a pavilion was generous. It was a lean and useful structure, repaired every season, with a low bench, a clay water jar, and a hook for a lantern. He had built it with help years ago. 2 neighbors had held the poles. A carpenter had laughed at the flimsy first draft and improved the lashings without being asked. A girl of 12 had insisted on painting a tiny blue line around the clay water jar because, she said, even in the dunes, a person deserved a little decoration. The line had faded, but not disappeared. Idris liked the shelter because it reminded him that even solitary work was sometimes held up by quiet acts of company. He hung the lantern on the hook, set the tool rack on the bench, and poured himself a little water from the jar into a brass cup he kept there. The water was cool from the clay. He drank slowly, then stood in the mouth of the shelter and looked out at the valley. Tonight he would not work there. This valley was for the middle of the night, or the final hour before home, when he wanted simpler patterns and smaller gestures. Its surfaces were beautiful, but narrow. The larger design he felt forming would need more space than that. So after a short pause, he took up his tools once more and climbed the far side, leaving the tea pavilion behind in a pool of warm lantern light. Beyond that ridge lay the moon court. This was where he most loved to work. The court was a wide, sloping face of sand held between 2 protective rises, with an upper crest curved like a sleeping shoulder and a lower floor smooth enough for long linked compositions. When conditions were right, moonlight spread across it so evenly that the whole place seemed lit from inside the sand itself. Tonight, the court was nearly perfect. Idris stopped at the edge and drew in one quiet breath. The air carried no hurry. The surface lay waiting. No beetle trails, no broken crust, no rough scatter from the last gust, only a broad, pale field. He set the lantern in the lee of a little shoulder of sand so that its light would not interfere with the moon. Then he unrolled the tools very carefully. The broad brush first, the long brush, the comb, the rake, the reed stakes, the cord, the folded cloth, the hourglass. He turned the hourglass once and placed it beside the lantern, not because he intended to obey it, but because he liked seeing the pale sand trickle slowly through its narrow neck while he worked. It reminded him that flowing down could be its own kind of beauty. He began by smoothing a wide lower section, long passes, side to side, a little upward, then side to side again. His feet found their places carefully so as not to disturb what had already been prepared. This was the part many observers found most soothing, though few ever saw it because most sensible people were in bed when Idris worked. The smoothing had a rhythm of its own, not dramatic, not showy, but undeniably calming. A surface becoming ready, a little disorder settling, a little roughness falling into peace. When enough of the lower slope had been prepared, Idris took the stakes and placed 4 of them at measured intervals around the working area. He tied the cord between 2 first, then adjusted the angle by hand. These were not rigid guides, only gentle references. He was not building a machine diagram or a tiled floor. He was laying out a field of movement. Still, a little structure at the beginning let the freer lines breathe with more confidence. Tonight's piece would begin with 3 great sweeping bands. He knew that before he drew the first one. The wind had said so at the humming posts. The welcome basin had confirmed it. The court itself invited it. 3 bands, flowing from high left to low right, echoing the tilt of the dune and the slow intervals of the air. Within those bands would come smaller patterns: fans, shell curls, threading lines, perhaps a row of little crescent hollows if the upper surface held, perhaps a drift dish later. He would know more once the first movement was made. Using the longest brush, he planted himself at the upper left edge of the prepared field and drew the first band. The line flowed wide and low, almost flat for the first span, then curved with increasing confidence down the slope before tapering away near the lower right. Beautiful. He did not say the word aloud. He almost never spoke while working. But the body sometimes recognized beauty before the mind had named it. And in the ease of his shoulders, the steadiness of his breath, the slight softening in his face, the recognition was clear. The second band ran parallel for part of its path, then diverged, crossing the first at a distance close enough to create tension, but not collision. The third started higher and descended in a broader sweep, enclosing a space between itself and the first 2 that would later hold finer work. The composition had now been set. Not finished, not even close, but alive. Alive in the way a house becomes alive once the first window is lit at dusk. Alive in the way a song becomes alive after its opening phrase. Alive in the way a path becomes alive after the first footstep. Idris stepped back, walked to the side, looked from lower down, then higher. He always changed position after the first major lines. A shape that seemed graceful from above might feel stiff from below. The moon court demanded honesty. The dunes had no interest in flattering a careless hand. But tonight, the bands held beautifully from every angle. The spaces between them were calm. The movement felt inevitable. He nodded once and continued. Inside the widest of the 3 bands, he used the crescent comb to lay down a row of repeated scallops, each one catching light in its upper edge and shadow in its lower. Then he softened every 3rd scallop with the corner of the cloth-wrapped finger, so the pattern alternated between crisp and tender. In the next band, he drew fine parallel threads that curved gently as they ran, like hair lifted in a breeze, or water finding an easy path down a pale slope. Between the 2nd and 3rd bands, he marked a line of small, seed-like ovals, each no larger than the bowl of a spoon, spaced just far enough apart to suggest breathing room. The work deepened. The dune changed character. What had been a broad, clean slope now carried layers of calm complexity. From a distance, it remained simple. Up close, it rewarded attention. Idris liked that balance. A person did not need to understand everything at once. Some beauty was kindest when it unfolded slowly. The moon rose higher. The upper ridge of the court glowed more strongly. The shadow line along the right-hand rise shifted, narrowing the dark strip there. One of the things Idris loved about working outdoors was that light was never static. Even untouched lines changed as the moon moved. A fan of grooves might look deep and solemn at one angle, playful and almost weightless at another. A shallow hollow might disappear entirely, then re-emerge with startling clarity an hour later. The night was always collaborating. Once the main bands and interior details were established, Idris took up the tamarisk rake and began a field of finer textures along the lower edge. This was slow work. He held the rake lightly and dragged it just enough to leave grooves without clumping the sand. One pass, lift, a finger width aside. Another pass, lift. Again, again. Soon, a wide area beneath the major curves had become softly lined, like fabric gently pleated by hand. Then, with the flat of the broad brush, he feathered the far edge so it faded out into untouched sand. This was the part of the composition that often pleased dawn visitors most, not because it shouted, because it dissolved. People like endings that know how to disappear gracefully. The pleated field did exactly that. It entered the design with care. It left it without fuss. Idris thought there was a lesson in that, though he never tried to phrase it. Some truths are kinder left inside the hands. He worked for a long while in that steady way, now standing, now kneeling, now crouching to inspect the edge of a fan pattern close to the surface, now walking wide around the piece to observe it from the other side. At one point, he used the brass dish to scoop and release a veil of slightly darker mineral sand from one of his jars, letting it fall in a thin crescent across a hollow, where the moonlight would later make the contrast subtle but satisfying. At another, he laid the cord in a shallow arc and brushed along its outer edge to create a line too pure to achieve by freehand alone. Then he removed the cord and softened the two ends so the precision would not feel cold. He never wanted his work to look mechanical. Skill was useful, control was useful, but if the dunes ever felt ordered by force, the night recoiled from it. There had to remain a sense that the patterns had drifted into being or had been discovered rather than imposed. So after every exact line, he added a breathing space. After every crisp element, a softened one. After every strong curve, an answering gentleness. When the hourglass had emptied twice, Idris knew the main phase of the court piece was complete. He sat back on his heels and looked. The three broad bands now traveled like flowing calligraphy across the slope. Within them rested fans, threads, ovals, scallops, and pleated textures. At the upper left, where the design began, he had added a cluster of small, half-moon hollows that caught the light like little cups. At the lower right, where it tapered away, the pleated field dissolved into the natural dune with almost imperceptible grace. The whole composition felt spacious, patient, self-possessed, exactly the sort of piece he had hoped the night wanted. He poured a little more water, took one sip, then rose and walked to the tea pavilion, which could just be seen from the ridge as a low, warm glow. He left the court piece behind him without anxiety. This mattered. He always left it at some point before the night was over. He never hovered over a finished design too protectively. An artist who never steps away tends to grip too tightly. An artist who trusts the night can leave. Back at the pavilion, he lit a second, smaller wick beneath a little brass kettle he kept there and prepared his second tea of the night. This one was always gentler than the first. No cardamom, no fennel, only mint and a few shreds of dried desert blossom, pale and almost scentless until touched by hot water. He sat on the bench while the tea steeped and listened. The humming posts gave a low tone now and then. Far off, perhaps near the settlement, a dog barked once and was silent. Wind moved over the reed roof with a dry whisper. The little kettle clicked faintly as it settled back onto the stand. This middle pause was sacred to him. Not sacred in a grand ceremonial sense. Sacred because nothing productive needed to happen in it. No lines to plan, no tools to clean, no design to defend. Just sitting, just drinking, just allowing the body to notice its own contentment. He thought many people hurried past such moments without seeing them. They treated pauses as gaps. To Idris, pauses were rooms. You could live in them for a while. When the tea was ready, he poured it into his blue-lined brass cup and held it between both hands. The steam rose into the cooler air and disappeared. He looked out across the darker valley beyond the pavilion. The sand there held long, narrow shadows now. The surfaces that had glowed earlier were becoming more subdued. The night was beginning its slow descent. This was his favorite turning. Not the high, bright start, not the initial thrill of first lines, but this quieter middle, when detail gave way to listening and the whole desert seemed to lower its voice another degree. He drank slowly until the cup was empty. Then he rinsed it with a little water, wiped it with the edge of the cloth, and returned to the moon court for the second phase. This phase was not about making more. It was about setting the piece in conversation with the wind. He had already read the air well enough to know where it might travel across the slope and where it would collect. Now he would give it a few invitations. Nothing heavy-handed, nothing obvious. Just a few places where drifting grain could soften one edge and deepen another. At the upper third of the design, he drew a run of narrow, angled channels inside one broad band, each tilted very slightly into the direction from which the next breath of wind would likely arrive. These channels would catch and guide. Along one fan detail, he lifted the outer lip a little with the flat of the brush so it would release grains more quickly. At the lower pleated field, he used the rake to deepen two areas and barely touch a third, ensuring the first would shadow more heavily while the second remained light. Then, near the cluster of half-moon hollows, he placed the brass dish half buried in the sand. Not to leave it there, but to shield a small section from the next few passes of air while the surrounding areas began to blur. The contrast would be lovely later. This was his most secret pleasure. Not the design alone. the design changing. Not the mark of the hand alone, the hand and the wind together. He did not feel diminished by that. Quite the opposite. He thought it would be exhausting to insist on complete control. Better to make the beginning beautifully and allow the world to finish the thought. For a while, he simply watched. The wind came, paused, came again. At first, the changes were almost too subtle to notice. A thin line of silver grains slipping down slope, a once crisp edge becoming velvety, the lip of a hollow growing rounder. Then the transformations gathered. One of the angled channels darkened beautifully. The shielded section beneath the brass dish remained pale, making the pattern on either side seem softer by comparison. The darker mineral crescent he had dusted earlier blurred just enough to seem like shadow rather than color. Perfect. He sat on the upper ridge of the court and watched the night work. This, more than any other part of his practice, had made him a calmer man over the years. Waiting while something lovely changed without intervention. Allowing beauty to move away from one form and into another. Not rushing to preserve the earlier version. Not mourning it while it was still becoming something else. Just watching. Just trusting. Just staying present enough to notice the gentle miracle of alteration. By now, the moon had climbed high enough that the lantern seemed unnecessary. He extinguished it. Immediately, the court felt wider, cooler, more silver than gold. The reed shelter in the valley became only a shape. The humming posts only darker marks on a rise. The settlement disappeared altogether, hidden by distance and low ground. For a little while, it seemed as though the whole world consisted only of Idris, the court, the wind, and the moon. Not lonely, not empty, simply enough. When he was ready to leave the court to its slow softening, he made one last circuit around it, stepping carefully wide so as not to disturb the lower edge. From below, the design now looked less drawn and more found. The channels had begun to gather pale streams of drifting sand. The upper half moons had softened into little cups of light. The pleated field, once more structured, now seemed almost like fabric stirred by a sleeping breath. He was deeply pleased. This was the moment when a piece stopped feeling like effort and started feeling inevitable. Then he packed the tools again and made his way beyond the court toward the quieter grounds. The next place was called the Threaded Hollow. Few from the settlement ever came there, even by day. It was a narrow, low basin, sheltered on three sides, with sand so fine it almost squeaked underfoot when very dry. It was not a place for grand compositions. It was a place for intimate work, for repeated patterns, for practice, for the kind of small, careful drawing that settled the mind even further after the larger work had been done. At the entrance to the hollow grew a single bent tamarisk, more shrub than tree, twisted low by years of wind, but stubbornly alive. In its branches hung thin lengths of shell and bone, not as decoration exactly, but because children from the settlement liked to leave small found things there after rare walks into the dunes. Some pieces clicked gently in the night air, some hung still. Idris always touched the lowest branch when he entered the hollow. Tonight it was cool and dry under his fingertips. The hollow itself lay in deep moon shadow, with only one sloping strip of silver light reaching across its floor. He did not bring the lantern in. He did not need it. This was lower work now, softer work. He knelt in the strip of moonlight and smoothed the section no larger than a blanket. Then, with the shortest brush, he began a series of linked loops. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each loop echoed the one before it without copying it precisely. Then a second row beneath, then a third. Soon the whole patch looked like a chain of sleeping moons or a row of quiet, sealed eyes. He added a small fan at one edge, then a run of tiny dots pressed in with the back of the brush handle. Then, using just 2 fingertips, he softened every second loop so the pattern alternated between crisp and blurred. This was not work he expected anyone else to see. The hollow often lost its details before dawn. That was precisely why he loved it. He could let his hand play here. He could make patterns merely for the pleasure of making them. He could repeat simple shapes until the mind thinned and quieted even further. After the loops came lines like woven reeds, then shell whorls, then little ladder patterns no longer than a finger, then a broad, shallow sweep drawn with the side of his hand. He brushed it away, drew it again, altered it, reduced it. For a long time, there was no need for anything but that intimate conversation between fingertips and sand. The big work had been done. Now the night could become almost private, almost dreamlike. Somewhere above the hollow, the shell pieces in the tamarisk clicked lightly. Click, pause, click, click. Then stillness. The sound was so small, it only deepened the silence around it. Idris paused and listened, then smiled to himself. He often thought that the desert loved tiny sounds best. A kettle settling, a wick catching, a cup placed on a bench, shells in a branch, the soft drag of a brush, the low hum of wind through carved stone. Nothing in this place needed volume to be memorable. When he had finished in the hollow, he did something he did only after the quieter work. He lay down on the upper slope, just above the patch of designs, with his head turned toward the stars and his hands resting over his middle. He did not doze, not usually. He simply looked upward and let the body feel the stored warmth still held under the top skin of cooling sand. Above him, the sky was dense with stars now, the moon clear and pale. Once in a while, a slower moving light crossed between them, far higher than any bird, Idris never troubled himself over what such lights were. He was content to call them passing things. Lying there, he often remembered that the dunes themselves were older than any pattern he made, older than the settlement, older than the names given to the rises and basins, older than the lantern on his wall, older than the reed shelter and the humming posts and the bowl of white pebbles. They had shifted before him and would shift after him. Oddly, this did not make him feel small in a sad way. It made him feel relieved. The dunes did not ask him to be permanent, only present. After some time, when the night had deepened fully into its quietest hour, Idris rose from the slope and brushed sand from his sleeves. It was time for the final place. Not every evening included it, but the best ones did. A little ridge beyond the threaded hollow, narrow and slightly curved, with one side facing the court from a distance and the other descending toward the long path home. He called it the Listening Ridge. It was where he ended the night, not by making, but by sitting, not by deciding, but by watching what had already been set in motion. He carried the tools there and laid them beside him without unwrapping them. From the ridge, he could not see every detail of the moon court, but he could see its overall movement. The three great bands showed faintly even at this distance, softer now, more blended into the dune. The welcome basin lay beyond sight. The tea pavilion was only a low shadow. The hollow behind him clicked occasionally with shell notes from the tamarisk. Everything felt woven together. All the places of the night linked by footstep, by habit, by repeated return. This was why his work calmed him so deeply. Not because each line was beautiful, though many were. Not because the desert was lovely, though it was. But because the whole night had a shape, a known unfolding, a welcome beginning, a middle of focused care, a quieter middle still, then a gradual descent into less doing, less planning, less intention. At the end, only watching, only breathing, only being there while the wind finished the conversation. He sat on the listening ridge and let his hands rest. He could feel the grooves in the wood handles through the cloth wrap beside him. He could smell dry reed, cool sand, and the faint, lingering mint from earlier tea. A breeze passed over the ridge and touched his cheek. Another followed more slowly. He did not think about tomorrow. He almost never did while sitting there. Tomorrow belonged to daylight, to small repairs, to market errands perhaps, to polishing the brass lamp, to changing the water in the courtyard basin, to sweeping the floor again at dusk. The ridge did not care for tomorrow. It cared only for now. A great many people, Idris sometimes thought, carried too much of the next day into the night. Not because they were foolish, because the world encouraged it. The world praised preparedness. The world admired vigilance. The world treated weariness almost as a sign of devotion. But the desert admired something else. It admired those who could lower their hands, those who could stop shaping for a while, those who could trust the dark to hold them without instruction. He would not have said such thoughts aloud, even if someone had been there beside him. He was not a man of speeches, but in the long calm sitting on the ridge, those understandings settled in him year after year, until they became part of the way he moved through the world. He spoke a little more slowly than others. He set down cups with more care. He closed doors without noise. He folded cloth neatly. He swept without irritation. He waited for kettles. He did not interrupt the moon. And all of that, he suspected, had begun here. At last he rose. The night had turned, not toward dawn yet, but toward home. He knew it in the cooling of the air and the hush in his muscles. He lifted the tools, wrapped and ready, looked once more across the distant court, then began the walk back. Returning home was always gentler than leaving it. The outward walk held expectation. The return held release. His footsteps were softer, his gaze less searching. The dunes he crossed now were not future work. They were companions to pass through. He descended the listening ridge, took the path by the tamarisk, crossed above the hollow, then moved steadily toward the tea pavilion. At the pavilion, he stopped only long enough to lift the empty brass cup, rinse it once with water from the jar, and leave it upside down on the bench to dry. He checked the kettle, extinguished the small remaining ember beneath it, touched the fading blue line on the water jar with one finger, then went on. The shelter would wait for another night. The jar would cool further in the air. The bench would gather a little dewless moonlight before dawn. At the humming posts, the wind had shifted again. This time, the highest note sounded first, then the deepest, then the middle. A quiet little descending pattern. He stood still and listened to all three. There was comfort in hearing familiar things behave slightly differently each night. Repetition was soothing. Variation kept it alive. Too much sameness becomes dull. Too much change becomes tiring. The desert rarely made that mistake. He crossed the welcome basin last. The first spiral he had drawn there earlier in the evening remained, though one side had already begun to blur. He crouched beside it, looked for a moment, then, on an impulse, drew one more spiral beside it, smaller than the first, with a little opening left at the outer edge, like a door not quite closed. Then he stood and left them both to the coming hours. By the time he reached Lanternbeck and looked down toward the settlement, the village lamps were mostly gone. Only 3 or 4 still burned. His own front room lamp would be one of them, low and patient in its wall niche. The houses looked as though they had folded themselves inward for the night. Doorways sealed, roof lines soft. lanes emptied of movement. He stood a little while at the crest, breathing in the cool air, then descended toward home. At the bowl of white pebbles, he paused again. This time he took one smooth stone from the dish and slipped it into his pocket. Tomorrow, or perhaps the following day, he would return another. He liked that small exchange, a quiet rhythm of taking and returning. A reminder that not every object had to be owned or explained. Some things could simply move through the hands and continue on. He unlocked his blue-green door and stepped inside. The front room welcomed him with its low, warm lamp and the settled scent of clay, oil, and clean air. He closed the door carefully behind him, set down the tool rack on the low bench, removed his sandals, and stood still for a moment in the hush of the house. The difference between the desert silence and the house silence always interested him. Outside, the silence was wide and alive, stretched over open distance. Inside, the silence was held, rounded, kept close by walls and cloth and familiar objects. Both were kind, each in its own way. First, he tended to the tools, always, no matter how late, no matter how content or tired he felt. He carried them to the workroom, relit the smaller lamp, and unrolled the wrap onto the table. The broad brush first. He shook it gently over a shallow basket to release the finer grains, then smoothed the bristles with his fingers. The long brush next, then the comb, then the rake. The cord was looped and hung on its hook, the stakes stacked neatly in their pottery jar. The brass dish wiped with the folded cloth until it held a soft, moon-colored sheen. He never left his tools in disorder, not because he feared disorder, because tomorrow's calm began with tonight's care. A tangled cord in the morning could irritate a man before tea. A dusty brush could drag where it should glide. A cup left unrinsed could carry yesterday's bitterness into a new evening. Small neglects multiplied. Small kindnesses did too. Idris preferred the second sort. When the tools were clean, he crossed to the shallow practice tray on the table. The surface of the sand there was still marked from the previous night, faintly, because he had not smoothed it before leaving earlier. He smiled. That would not do. With the broad side of his hand, he leveled the tray in 2 easy passes. Then, using one fingertip, he drew 3 curved bands across the pale surface, echoing the moon court. Inside the center band, he made a tiny row of scallops. Then he used the heel of his thumb to blur one edge. A miniature version of the night, reduced, remembered, gentle. He did not keep the little design for long. He looked at it, let himself enjoy it. Then, just as he always did, he smoothed it away. The tray became flat again, ready again. There was a private satisfaction in that final gesture, a small domestic version of what the wind was doing beyond the walls. Nothing held too tightly, nothing kept merely because it had been made. Next, he went to the courtyard. The night-blooming flowers had opened fully now. 3 of them, pale almost to silver in the moonlight. He poured a little fresh water into the clay basin at their base and stood there for a moment, breathing in their light scent. Above, the square of sky between the walls was rich with stars. The roofline cut it into a neat frame. How odd, he sometimes thought, that people crossed deserts to seek vast, open skies, while one of his favorite views of the heavens was this small, quiet square above his own little yard. It reminded him that peace was not always about size. Sometimes it was about proportion. Back inside, he extinguished the smaller lamp in the workroom and left the front room lamp burning while he prepared for sleep. He washed his face and hands in the sleeping room basin. The water was cool enough to lift the last warmth from his skin. He dried his hands on a linen cloth hanging by the doorway. Then he sat on the edge of the sleeping mat and loosened the knot of the thin sash at his waist. There was no rush, no final task demanding attention, no letter half-written, no unresolved conversation, no indoor noise, only the lamp, only the house, only the wide, patient dunes beyond the wall. He lay down and drew the blanket lightly over himself. Then he turned the front room lamp lower, but did not yet put it out. He liked its faint glow reaching the edge of the sleeping room. A suggestion of light rather than light itself. A reminder that home was still holding him. From outside came no voices now. Only once, faintly, the click of a clay bell under someone's awning. Then even that was gone. And because this was his habit, and habits often become the soft rails along which a peaceful life can travel, Idris pictured the places of the night, one by one before sleep. The workroom, with its shelf of tools and smooth tray. The courtyard flowers. The blue-green door. The bowl of white pebbles. Lantern back. The welcome basin. The humming posts. The tea pavilion. The moon court. The threaded hollow. The listening ridge. Each place in order. Each place visited gently in the mind once more. Each place released. By now, the wind beyond the settlement would be moving through the moon court more freely. The angled channels would be gathering fine lines of silver drift. The softened fans would lose another degree of sharpness. The pleated field would relax further into the dune. The little half-moon cups would become shallower. The work in the threaded hollow would almost certainly be blurring fast. One of the spirals in the welcome basin might still hold its shape. The smaller second spiral perhaps less so. And the great bands, those patient, sweeping bands, would remain visible the longest, because broad, calm things often do. That thought pleased him, not because he wished his work to survive, because he liked knowing which parts of it yielded first. The delicate details always gave themselves up early. Then the finer textures. Then the shaded veils. Finally, the broad foundations. There was tenderness in that order, as if the night knew to keep the larger gesture visible a little longer. the way the memory of a kind voice may remain after the exact words are gone. He lowered the lamp one last time, then extinguished it. The room darkened fully, but not to black. Moonlight still laid a pale strip across the floor through the woven screen. The sleeping mat held its familiar weight. The blanket held its light warmth. His breathing slowed, and the dunes continued their work without him. So now, as the story begins to quieten around you, and the house of Idris settles into darkness, you can let yourself rest there too. You do not need to follow him any further. You do not need to keep watch over the court. You do not need to preserve the spirals. You do not need to defend the fine scallops or the pleated field or the tiny patterns in the hollow. The wind knows what to do. The night knows what to do. The dunes know what to do. You can let the body grow a little heavier now. You can let the bed take more of your weight. You can let the forehead smooth, the jaw soften, the tongue rest, the shoulders lower, the hands become still. The breath move gently in and out without any need to manage it. Picture the moon court once more, the broad silver slope, the three great flowing bands, the finer details resting inside them, the moonlight touching the ridges, the wind crossing slowly from one side to the other, not rushing, not taking, only softening, only continuing, only turning the work into its next quiet form. Picture the tea pavilion, the low bench, the clay water jar with its fading blue line, the small brass cup drying upside down, the reed roof breathing in the air, the warm lantern glow that once held the middle of the night, now gone. Everything simple, everything waiting patiently for another evening. Picture the threaded hollow, the strip of silver moonlight, the loops drawn in the fine sand, the little shell clicks in the bent tamarisk, the small, intimate patterns, made not for an audience, not for praise, but for the pleasure of gentle repetition. A line, then another, then another, then the soft blur of a fingertip, then stillness. Picture Idris returning home. The bowl of white pebbles at the corner shelf, the blue-green door opening, the lamp in the wall niche, the tools unrolled and cleaned one by one, the practice tray smoothed, the little echo of the night drawn into miniature and then released again, the courtyard flowers opening under starlight, the final lowering of the lamp, the simple peace of being home. And now, you do not need even the pictures quite so clearly. They can begin to blur a little. The moon court can become only silver and curve. The tea pavilion only warmth and shadow. The hollow only softness and repetition. The house, only lamplight and rest. Idris, only a calm presence moving more slowly now. The dunes, only long, quiet breathing under the moon. Nothing more needs to happen. The story does not need another turn. No surprise is coming. No demand is waiting. No voice will suddenly rise. The night has already become what it needed to become. A place to lower your guard. A place to stop arranging. A place to stop reaching into the next thing. If thoughts come, let them pass like grains moving over a ridge. If another thought follows, let that one pass too. No grain of sand needs to be caught. No passing shape needs to be held in the hand. Let the mind behave like the court beneath moonlight, marked for a while, softened after. Still beautiful either way. The welcome basin is quiet now. The humming posts give only the faintest note. The tea pavilion stands in shadow. The threaded hollow forgets its smallest patterns. The listening ridge holds its calm. The moon court breathes under the wind. The settlement sleeps. The front room lamp is out. The workroom is dark. The little house at the edge of the dunes rests. And you can rest too. You can let yourself drift a little further now. A little further. A little softer. A little lower. Nothing to prove to the night. Nothing to complete before sleep is allowed. Nothing to keep bright and sharp. Even the loveliest lines in the sand are permitted to soften. Especially the loveliest lines. The moonlight grows paler. The details fade. Only the broad, calm shapes remain. Only the long curves. Only the sense of wide, quiet ground under a vast, gentle sky. Only the feeling of cool air and soft sand and distance and ease. Only the rhythm of the night going on without effort. If you are still awake, that is all right. There is no rush. You are already where you need to be. You are already in the slower part of the night. Already in the place where everything has loosened. Already in the hush after the work is done. Already in the calm that comes when nothing more is required. The dunes continue. The wind continues. The moon continues. The slow, soft editing of the sand continues. All without strain. All without noise. All without asking anything of you. So let go a little more. Let the breath be easy. Let the limbs be heavy. Let the thoughts thin out like lines in drifting sand. Let the story become only texture now, only atmosphere, only silver, only quiet, only the soft hush of the desert at night. And softer still. And softer still. good night.